Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to my very first Sunday sidebar. And I'm creating this because I feel like, first of all, let me back up a little bit and explain to you what a sidebar really is. For attorneys, it's the time that when we're in the middle of a trial or we're in the middle of a hearing, we approach the bench and we actually talk to the judge, and we call that a sidebar. Because normally what we're saying in court is recorded. So a sidebar gives us the opportunity to have a conversation with the judge that's not being recorded and it's technically off the record. So I wanted to create a space for you where we can talk about things off the record. And what I mean by that is where we get a space to just ask some questions, talk to an attorney, talk to a mom, talk to each other about what's really important for us and how the law affects our families. I've been doing this for several years now, and I see time and time again how what I understand as a mom and what I understand as an attorney can sometimes be in conflict, but it's really, really important to understand how the law works because it really does have an effect on our lives. It affects our relationships. It affects how often we see our children, what we get to do with our children, and when we get to do that. So that's why I've created Sunday sidebars. So my goal is to do this for you, just to educate you, to be able to answer some of your questions in a very safe space where there's no judgment. And we get to do this as at least twice a month. So this first one is going to deal with COVID, because especially since the pandemic hit, I found that custody has become probably the number one or two reason why people actually file and are having to deal with court. Because parents either keep their children away because they want to make sure they're safe. And on the other side of that, parents are not able to see their children, not understanding why. Because under any other condition, even if your child is sick, both parents have a right to be able to nurture that child. So we're going to talk about some of those things because so many of you have questions about this. I've been to court many times over this. There have been separate legal education just on this issue because it is having such a huge effect on families. So with that said, I've created just a quick and dirty presentation. Now I'm doing this at the same time, just this one time for my Facebook group, because like I said, you guys are going to be able to get special access to things just for joining my group. So if you want to join my Facebook group, please come along, join the club. It's Families First with Lakisha Dean. You can find me on Facebook. Join the group because you'll get access to information like this on a continuing basis. Plus, you'll also get some special offers. So let's dive right into it. And if you guys are having any issues later on, always feel free to shoot me some questions in the Facebook group, give us a call at the office, send me an email, because I do use the questions that you have to create a platform so that I can be there to answer them for you. Okay. So what I've done, like I said, is I've created this, created a slideshow just for those of you who are doing this through the webinar. We'll kind of get to take a look at what we're going to be talking about today. So let's see, let me set this up for you. Okay, so for those of you who've never met me, never heard of me, obviously I'm Lakisha Dean. I've been practicing law now for over 20 years. I graduated from Temple Law School in 2001. I have two children of my own who are now, my son Xavier is 13, my daughter Jassy turned 16 in November. So we have teenagers in the house. My husband is a chiropractor, and we actually are located right next to each other. I'm a former prosecutor. So what that means for me is that prosecutors, or anyone who practices criminal law, we're really trained to go hard in the courtroom. So I've done that for several years, and I use that experience when necessary for my clients, because oftentimes in family law, a lot of the hard work, a lot of the issues, the problems actually begin long before we walk into a courtroom. So if you're at the point where you're making it to the courtroom, you're going to need an advocate. You're going to need someone who has a strong voice, who understands the process, to be present, show up for you, and do what's necessary. And my experience as a prosecutor, as on both sides, and also as a criminal defense attorney, really helped me with what I do for my families. So I also have a personal passion for family law. I'll quickly tell you a little bit about it, but if you want to know more about my story and how I came to practice family law, you need to visit my website and go to my About Me video, where I explain that my nephew was actually pretty much given away, unfortunately, or he was adopted without my brother's consent to a family in Canada. And I had to do something about it. I mean, he was only about 3 months at the time, and my brother obviously wanted to be a presence in his life. So I had to kind of hit the ground running. And I've also passed the bar in New York. So this case was actually in New York. That's my hometown. That's where I'm originally from. So I had to go to court in New York. But remember, the child was in Canada. So Canada doesn't have to listen to anything that New York says. So that presented a whole set of legal issues and legal problems. But we managed to get through it. And I would say within about 3 months later, my brother and I were able to get on a plane to Canada and bring my nephew back. And I saw that I was able to have such a tremendous impact on the life of one family. Fortunately, it was my family. And I really wanted to be able to use my skills and the talents that I was blessed in to be able to help other families. So that's how I came to be involved in family law. So one thing that I want folks to understand before we even talk about the impact of COVID is that what the courts focus on. The public policy of New Jersey is really to have children who come from separated parents or divorced parents to have equal access to both parents. Now, I know so many of my clients, especially you guys out there, feel like the courts favor moms. Well, that's actually not true, but that may have been the case at one time. So your beliefs are not based in something that's a myth. It's something called the tender years doctrine, which the courts used to follow. And what that meant was that when a child was under the age of 7, that the courts felt that it needed to be with its mom because its mom was more nurturing and would be the one that would be more hands-on with the child. But as things evolved and the system itself began to modernize, courts realized that that's not always the case. Maybe dad can't breastfeed, but he can certainly be present in that child's life just as much as mom, and it's just as important for the child. So I understand many of you feel that way. That's really not supposed to be the case, okay? As I said here, in any proceeding involving the custody of a child, the rights of both parents shall be equal. Now, when the court looks at custody, and the reason we're talking about custody in the context of COVID is because that's what we need to examine first. We need to look at what type of custody you have and what your parenting time is, because that should be the structure that's already in place. So those of you who don't have a court order, what you need to know, if you don't have a court order that addresses the type of custody you have, custody is a legal technicality. So while you may feel, you and your ex-husband, you and your ex-partner may feel that you have something established already in terms of your rights with respect to your child and how often you get to see your child, the law does not necessarily recognize that until you have a court order. So it's important, if you need to formalize what you have or the relationship you're going to have between your co-parent and your child, you need to do that through a court order. And that can be done by consent. I mean, sometimes it may be best to do that while the parties still agree. But if you don't have a court order and you have an issue where a parent keeps a child from you and say you need to go to the police, the first thing they're going to tell you is ask you for is your court order. And then they may tell you, you need to go to the court system. You need to go to family court to get this straightened out. So I just want you to understand that. So we take a look at, if you do have a court order, what your custody is and what kind of parenting time you have. So let's go from there. Now, in most cases, there's usually joint legal custody or sole custody. Sole custody is actually pretty rare. And a lot of people, when they come to my office, they say, I want full custody. Oftentimes they're referring to sole legal custody. But again, I want you to understand that that's not always something that's easy to get, because you pretty much, in order to get sole legal custody, you have to demonstrate that there's a reason why the child should not have equal access to both parents, or why both parents shouldn't be involved in the decision making for that child. So that could be because one parent is actually a harm to the child, or has completely abandoned the child. So if you have the other parent coming to court to say, I want parenting time, I want to be there, you may not feel that it's appropriate, but a court's going to begin that analysis by looking at you and the co-parent pretty much equally. And one thing I stress to my clients all the time is that the court's going to do what's in the best interest of the child. Okay, so it's really, really important to understand that. Now, I want to take a minute too to let you guys know that if you're doing this from the webinar, if you've registered and you're listening to the webinar, you can always type your question in the chat box. Those of you who are listening on Facebook, just shoot me a question and I can try to answer that in the chat as they come up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm not going to keep you long. I know you have church today. I'm a mom. I'm sitting at home. My husband's cooking breakfast in the room right next to me with my kids. So you'll probably hear a lot going on in my house alone. So trust me, I get it. But I just wanted to take the time out to explain this to people because I feel it's really, really important. So, okay. So joint legal custody, as opposed to sole custody, allows both parents to be involved in the major decisions regarding the child. That is, where the child goes to school, the child's well-being, the child's religion. So in the event that, God forbid, one parent is out with the child, they fall and they break their elbow, and there's surgery that's required. Well, that surgery, you should not really consent to it unless it's an absolute emergency without reaching out to the other parent. I mean, common sense should tell you this, but I get it. Our relationships with co-parents are very different. They go, I mean, there's a spectrum, as we all know, and some people get along great. Some people can't even stand to look at each other. But you need to understand the difference between joint and sole custody in New Jersey. So then, one of the common arrangements in this is for one parent to be the parent of primary residence and the other to be the parent of alternate residence. Now, they each carry slight differences, and we'll cover that another time because I really want to get to that question that a lot of us have about the effects of COVID. So just remember, when the court's making a decision as to who gets custody, who gets parenting time, it's going to look at the needs of the parents. I'm not saying that it's going to ignore you, but it's also going to determine that decision based on what's in the best interest of the child. Okay. There we go with the best interests again. So I've listed, if you're doing this and you've registered and you're doing this through the webinar, I've listed out the factors that the court considers in granting custody. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them here, but again, that's why it's important to register if you can, because you will get access to the replay almost immediately. It'll probably be available to you either later tonight or tomorrow morning. And you'll get to really take a look at these slides because they're packed with information that you can always use as a resource later on. But I want to get to what I think is really important here. One of the factors is the safety of the child. And it says here the safety of either parent from physical abuse by the other parent. Now, we're not dealing with physical abuse, but we are dealing with the safety of the child. So oftentimes in the cases that I get that are related to COVID, parents, of course, and it may be on both sides, are concerned when there is a relative that lives in the house with the child who's contracted COVID, or when the child, him or herself, has contracted COVID. I'm going to separate that situation from when there's the concern with the child leaving the home that they're going to get COVID. Now, if the child or someone they've been exposed to has come down with COVID, then yes, it may be okay for that child to quarantine. In fact, the CDC requires it. So that child may not be able to go to school. That child may in fact have to quarantine from siblings and may in fact have to quarantine from one of the parents. But the first thing you have to remember is to communicate. Decisions like that should not be made unilaterally. They should not be made by just one parent alone without consulting with the other parent, so that both of you get to make a decision as to what happens with the child during this process. So if it is the case that the child needs to be quarantined and the parents don't agree about it, then I would say that the parent of primary resident needs to make that decision, and then hopefully that can be worked out later on if the parents agree. But if not, we're going to talk about some solutions. The other situation is when parents are just really concerned about even letting the child leave the home or go to the other parent's home because of potential exposure. Well, potentially we know we're all open to exposure just by stepping out of our door. Oftentimes, when people do contract COVID, they can't always trace it to where they get it from. And unfortunately, it's something that we don't have a lot of control over. That's why it's considered a pandemic. So, but that cannot be used as a reason to prevent you from seeing your child, or that you should use as a reason to prevent the other parent from seeing the child. That's something that definitely has to work out. Despite the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, remember, the child still deserves access to both parents. So you've got to figure out ways to make it work. And certainly I would say, parents, please follow the guidelines of the CDC when it comes to wearing a mask or whatever precautions you need to take to continue that parenting time schedule that you have either by agreement or through the court. But it's really important that you work hard to continue that, not just for your sake, but for the child's sake. So, because judges really, I have some judges who really frown, they get very upset when they see that parents are keeping children away from their parents just because they're afraid they might catch it. Unfortunately, that's not a good reason. Because remember, not just the parent that is the parent of the primary residence, it's not just their responsibility to nurture the child and protect the child. That's the responsibility of both parents. And if you really feel that that's not the case, then you can always file a motion. I would certainly suggest before you do that, you talk to an attorney first. These things need to be talked through. If you're not going to do that with the other parent, do it with someone who's familiar with the law and can kind of help you put your feelings and emotions into perspective when it comes to how the law is going to view that. Because the emotional and the legal can be two very, very different things. And oftentimes as an attorney, part of my job is guiding people, navigating people through that process. And as anyone who I've represented before understands that I'm going to tell them the good and the bad, because that's the only way I can effectively serve you. So let's move through some of these slides now that we've explained what the most important factors are that the court's going to look at least when it comes to COVID. And as I mentioned to you before, parents have to use their best judgment in doing what is in the best interest of the child. And if it's a joint legal custody situation, a parent cannot unilaterally change a court order without the consent of the other parent or the court. Like I said, explore all options with the co-parent. If they've already been exposed, okay, give them time to quarantine. Maybe you can do some makeup time, but talk about it. And I know there are many of you who can't talk to one another. I get it, especially if there's been a divorce or a nasty breakup. But there are apps out there. There's something called the Family Law Wizard app that allows you to communicate about your child without having to speak to one another. There's another app called App Close, which I believe is free, where you can communicate with the co-parent without having to talk to them and get into an argument with them. So consider some things like that. But you also have to remember, this is a balancing act. You want to keep everyone safe. So parents on the other side, when you may not have primary care of your child, remember that we have to be careful with exposure. We have to think about other relatives in the home. There may be other children, there may be elderly relatives. We want to make sure everyone stays as safe as possible without trying to infringe on your right to have parenting time with your child. So what are some possible solutions? Arrange for makeup time. If someone has been exposed or the child themselves has COVID, then the CDC has guidelines with respect to the length of the quarantine period. Understand and respect that. But then have makeup time. If you're the parent that has to remain with the child to care for them during the quarantine period, then allow that other parent to have that makeup time. If it's 5 days, if it's 10 days, maybe that doesn't happen all at once because that would disrupt the child's schedule, but maybe you work that in 2 or 3 days at a time. That parent gets some extra time with the child to make up for that. And if you have to, you can file a motion to modify a court order, even if that's going to be temporary. That's, to me, should not always be required, but that's what I do all day, every day. So I understand that there's a need for that at times. But I also think that it's really, really important that you at least have a consultation with someone about what your rights are, what you should do, because that can help you put things in perspective and save you some time, money, and energy before you file in court. You use a whole day and have to take off of work, and it may not actually happen as you expect. So take the time before you file to have a consultation. At the very worst, especially, and this may be for a lot of my parents out there who just have been completely denied access to their child, like completely. It violates a court order and the other parent has said to you, this is not happening. You're not getting this child for a certain period of time or ever until I feel it's right. Well, then you may need to file an emergent motion. Now, remember, though, the standard is much higher when you do that. And you have to demonstrate that the child is at risk of imminent danger or harm. And that's not always easy to do. But sometimes you have to. Depending on your particular situation, you may have to. So I just want to let you know that that is an option if necessary. And again, you will need to talk to an attorney. So for those of you who are doing this through the webinar, I've given you some resources here. I've actually created what I call a custody success toolkit that helps you and answers some of your questions about custody that we've talked about here. You can also look on my website, www.lakishadeanlaw.com, or you can just give us a call at the office at 856-359-5222. I didn't see anyone with any questions here yet, but like I said, we're going to be doing this on a regular basis throughout the year. So please feel free to shoot me your questions, give me a call, email me. For those of you who have actually joined today, I have a special for you where if you give us a call or you want to set up a consultation and you use the word COVID, we will give you a 25% discount off of your consultation. So I hope you all got something out of this. I look forward to hearing from you all again. To my Facebook family, thank you for joining me, and I'll reach out to you soon. And that's going to be a conclusion to this webinar. Take care and enjoy your Sunday.